I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. What are we looking at today, Rob?
So I'm gonna try to read the title of this story as it's written.
I thought your Chinese was pretty good. Shouldn't you be able to read this?
My Chinese is amazingly. My Sanskrit is not so great. So the title of this one, I'm being sarcastic, incidentally. My Chinese is not amazing.
No, it is.
Not phrased with that sort of lingering amazing.
He's being very humble, very.
He's being realistic. The title. This is my best attempt at a title. The Great Maudgalyayana Rescues His Mother from Hell.
Can you just give us the Chinese title for that?
It's Mulian Saves His Mother.
Yeah. So Mulian Zhumu.
Well, this is sort of your bailiwick. You're big on the stories found in the Dunhuang caves. So why don't you give us some kind of background to
I wouldn't say I'm big on it. I'm concerned
this
with
is your thing, dude.
I'm concerned with ideas of foreignness in China. And one of the things that's so interesting about Chinese Buddhism is, even though Buddhism is flourishing in China now, it doesn't originally come from China. Of course, it comes from India. The Gautama Buddha was an Indian prince. When it comes into China, it's this very much a foreign thing. And that's apparent in this text. It's obsession with discussing ideas of foreignness in China. So this story, as a larger story, exists. It exists today in China, and it has existed continuously for
a long time.
Several thousand years. Over 1,000 years. And I have actually seen plays of it performed in Taiwan. It's still performed today. But this particular text that we're dealing with, so this version of the story, I'm going to get really highfalutin here and do literary stuff. This instantiation of the story, it was lost for about 900 years. As I'm sure many listeners know, there are some caves in Dunhuang that are incredibly important for our knowledge of the period.
Where is Dunhuang, Lee?
Dunhuang is on the very edge of Gansu province. It's in the part where China, quote-unquote Chinese China, goes away and you start slipping into the deserts of Central Asia. So we're talking about not that far from Xinjiang, where there are many more Uyghurs than there are Han Chinese. So we're talking about this place. It's on the border of Tibet, Central Asia, Mongolia, Han Chinese culture. All of these cultures are coming together right at this point.
Frontier town, as it were.
Yeah, it's kind of like, think of it as a 9th century Chinese
Dodge City.
Exactly.
Nice.
What's so fascinating about that particular spot, and you can go there are these things called the Mogao Caves. I've been there. They're amazing. It was a major place for the study of Buddhism because as I said before, Buddhism was transmitted into China through Central Asia.
Right.
So you've got all of these kinds of things passing back and forth. And sometime before 1000 AD, there was something going on, and Mogao just kind of stopped. It just ended. The kind of creative energies that were invested in the area dried up. Someone, we don't know who, but before 1000 AD, they took all of these manuscripts and put them in a side cave to one of the caves, and then sealed it up. So it wasn't until about 1900 that a couple of Western explorers got those texts with the help of a Chinese Taoist monk who is considered a traitor to the nation, oftentimes, I would say, in China now. But these Westerners, they took many of these things, and so the manuscripts are now more in London and Paris. Those are the two main places. There are some in Seoul, some in Beijing, some in Tokyo. But this manuscript was found in those bootload of documents that were contained in tons of different languages. You had Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Chinese, of course. All of these different languages are kind of all just found in this jumble.
Wow. So we're basically looking at sort of like after Prince died and they realized he had a vault of original music he'd never released. It's a little like that.
It's exactly like that. It's exactly like that.
This is the Prince archives and the Dodge City of ancient China.
That is a film I want to see.
That is
Prince
amazing.
in Dodge City.
Prince in Dodge. I would buy a ticket to that. I never go to cinemas, but I would totally buy a ticket for that.
Anyways, so this version of the story of Mulian, it represents what's essentially the earliest we have, one of the earliest texts that we have of Chinese vernacular fiction. Now, we've talked about the May 4th movement before. The May 4th movement occurs 1915 to 1919. The thing about the May 4th is it claims to be the first literary movement to go, hey, we're going to write in vernacular Chinese. I call BS. Happened 900 years before, at least, maybe earlier. We have proof of it. This is written in a kind of vernacular Chinese, but what's happening is that the reason these stories die out is because once the kind of market for these stories disappears, they just kind of dry up and we don't get people preserving them. So it wasn't that before 1919, no one in China wrote in vernacular. What actually happened is no one in China before 1919 cared about what was written in vernacular enough to preserve it. And so we don't really have that much vernacular. We have some. We've talked about the Huaben stories from the Ming and Qing, but we don't really have that much vernacular before 1919 because just people weren't keeping it. They decided that that was not important. If it's written in vernacular, the language that people use in their everyday lives, then it can't be that good.
And of course, that's the catch, right? Whenever we talk about the May 4th movement, is because the May 4th does not say this is the first. They're playing off of newer ideas of what it means to be literary with a capital L and what it means to be vernacular. Mm-hmm. They're sort of updating both terms, right? So it's not just that we're writing in vernacular; it's that. We have to do a longer discussion of that, but they're importing ideas of the literary from Europe, trying to sort of recast Chinese tradition. And this is an interesting. The story we're talking about today is an interesting entry there because it both is and is not Chinese vernacular fiction. It is written in vernacular, but the story is not Chinese. The story is Indian that has been transmitted. This is basically a Chinese rewrite of an Indian story. Kind of.
I mean, it's more of an adaptation. We have versions of this story existing in Sanskrit and Pali, I believe, before Buddhism even comes to China, or around the time that Buddhism comes to China.
And in any case, what I was going to throw in there with that, and you're right, this is an adaptation. This is not like a translation we're dealing with here, right? But the notion of vernacular literature with a big L in front of it in the 20th century becomes this whole original composition thing. Like everything I'm putting on the page is coming from my brain. Now, of course, it's all kinds of problems with that.
It represents my true feeling. It's a very romantic notion.
It's a very romantic notion.
We use romantic referring to the literary movement of the...
Or it's very Flaubert, like I'm just observing and transmitting what I see.
I would prefer Wordsworth and Coleridge, but...
We're getting a little too knee-deep in the literary nerdiness.
Oh, my goodness, I love being knee-deep in the lit nerd.
I do too, but... You know, our listeners probably will not. So, but this story is, it is in every sense a frontier story, right?
It's absolutely a frontier story.
Geographically in the ethnic frontiers of China, but it's also frontier in that, well, it's not an original composition, but it's not a translation either. It's kind of an adaptation, but kind of not. Like what, you know?
How do we deal with this?
Exactly.
So.
And I should jump in, though, real quick and just mention this. Translated by Eugene Eoyang. Eoyang is his last name, who I'll just give him a shout-out because he is one of the great translation scholars of the 20th century. So if you like this kind of stuff, I would encourage you to read him. So
Rob, why don't you go ahead and break the story down?
Thank you for asking, Lee, in that completely unprompted way. So the story is... Well, Lee and I have both basically described it to each other as Dante's Inferno-ish. You have a monk... whose name in Chinese is Mulian, and I guess the Sanskrit name is Maudgalyayana, whose mother ends up in hell because in one of the hells, the Avicii hell, I think.
Really bad place to be.
Really bad place to be. Because she's essentially hoarded all her money and refused to help people her whole life. Now,
specifically refused to help Buddhists.
Yes. And so Mulian figures this out through a series of circumstances and goes through a series of adventures to rescue her from the lowest of the lowest hells and bring her back to human form. That's the shell of the plot. And just like you can summarize Dante's Inferno in about a sentence, Dante visits hell. It's that kind of thing here. Of course, what makes it a story, and one that's still recited, is, of course, all the many adventures and weird places that Mulian, or Maudgalyayana, goes to.
Let's just go with Mulian.
Let's just go with Mulian.
Mulian's interesting because he asked his mother to try and preserve, like to try and give to Buddhist organizations before he left to become a monk. And she doesn't. And then he comes back and finds her dead and eventually winds up just visiting her in hell, as we do with our mothers. And he tries to find her in hell, and he finds his dad.
But he doesn't find his dad in hell. He finds his dad in heaven.
He finds his dad in a good place.
Okay, I want to put this in real quick, because one of the really difficult things about this story is if you come from a Judeo-Christian tradition, which most readers, even if they're not Christian or Jewish, are steeped enough in to be familiar with sort of the schematics and whatever. Encountering this, about 5 pages in, I was like, okay, hang on a second. So this is not hell with a capital H. This is one of many hells.
Yeah.
And this is also, he's going to this other place, but it's kind of heaven, but it's actually one of about 20 different heavens.
But it's not. That's not that different from Dante, right? Like Dante has one hell, but many parts. This hell has many hells, but they're each essentially a part of hell.
Right, but because it's given the plural,
sure.
A hell versus, Dante's Inferno is just hell with many stages. This is this kind of hell versus another kind of hell versus, Anyway, it's fascinating, but it's also a little tricky to get oriented. One
of the fascinating things I find about Mulian, though, is he uses his holiness from a Buddhist perspective. He has become this great Buddhist figure, and he uses his holiness to essentially rescue his mother. He's he's wandering through all these different hells that you mentioned. He keeps trying to find his mom, and it's really kind of, I don't know, it's very repetitive, I found. But eventually he finds his mom, he cries a bunch, he eventually evokes the Buddha to rescue her based off of his holiness, and things work out kind of hunky-dory. So a couple of interesting things about this is, first, it's essentially a Buddhist propaganda, right?
Right.
At that time, which we're talking about the Tang Dynasty, Buddhism is becoming very big, but the more nativist-oriented scholars are very much of the Confucian vein. And so there's this conflict set up. Buddhism is this foreign thing that's really popular and very colorful, but not considered authentically, genuinely Chinese. We're simplifying this a bit.
Just a bit.
But it comes in and it grabs a hold of the populace and becomes incredibly popular. But there's this tension with the sort of native Chinese tradition of Confucianism. And one of the things that Confucians will say is that Buddhists are bad because Buddhists shave their hair, which was given to them by their parents. They leave their parents behind. They completely abandon family. And so they, Buddhists, are unfilial. I'm not making this claim. This is a claim that Confucians in Tang Dynasty made. This story turns that around because what it essentially does is it says, actually, Buddhists are way more filial than Confucians. Because what Buddhists do is even though they turn their back on their family and do the whole Buddhist monk thing, Buddhists can rescue their parents from hell. When a Confucian's parent dies, they mourn for a certain period of time and yada, 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 but they can't do anything for them when they get to hell. That's the Buddhist claim about Confucians. But the thing that makes this story so popular and so long-lasting is that it gives the sense that Buddhists can be filial beyond the grave.
Yeah, which is a huge claim and would have been hugely important for any reception of Buddhism, right? You can't, if you're going to spread it, it has to be in the language of the times, right? Which would be Confucianism. I'm curious, too, and tell me what you think of this, but the other thing that really struck me about the story is the bureaucracy. So the reason I say that is because everywhere that Mulian goes, there's a prescribed structure. So first you talk to this person who is the guardian of the whatever it is. And this person says, well, actually, that's not my job. That's the guy above me, this guy who's the guardian of the stuff that there's this hierarchy that he has to go through. This person is the king of this thing who has this responsibility in this hell and nowhere else and that kind of thing. And only the Buddha is capable of accessing everything. And China, the Tang Dynasty, has also gone through quite a few centuries of rigid civil bureaucratization, right? And I'm wondering if any of that has seeped in. I haven't read enough of the older Buddhist stories to know if this is a thing or not, but I have to wonder if this is also a gesture towards the governmental organization of the time, or I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a kind of cosmology oftentimes in different cultures mirrors the way things are set up in the government of the state that is associated with that religion. It almost seems to legitimize the state, which is what's interesting, because I'm kind of wondering if the Indian version had all this bureaucracy.
That's what I'm wondering, because what Mulian does effectively, he's a great hero and all that, but he gets his mother out by successfully negotiating all the different levels of the sort of heavenly bureaucracy.
If I could say, he's a 9th century cosmological Tang Dynasty bureaucratic warrior.
Yeah, that gives people absolutely nothing. That should be on a T-shirt. But it is that what makes him that, though, is unlike, I think, some other heroic stories, like in a lot of the Greek myths, where someone storms through the underworld and rescues or negotiates several tasks in heroic fashion. This one, in all humility, Mulian, supplicates and discusses and basically knows exactly.
And he cries. You forgot to mention that. He cries a lot.
Yeah. Every time he hears about his mother and can't find her. At some point, he doesn't even feel like a hero. In the question about this story, sort of action movie way, you're like, really, dude? Another cry fest? Like, go.
That's
the
question.
Somebody.
Is he a hero? Do you think?
I don't know. It's a good question, actually, because in the tradition that we are used to reading from, not really.
Can I say this?
Yeah.
I think he is, because if you think about it in terms of Buddhist propaganda in China being told in Confucian terms.
That's a lot of qualification.
If you think about it in those terms. Then yes, because what is a good Confucian supposed to do when their parent dies? Weep. Mm-hmm. They weep the heck out of stuff.
Yeah, they know how to weep.
He is essentially performing that ritualistic thing that Confucians are supposed to do. But the cool thing about this, the thing that makes Mulian so powerful, is that not only does he cry, he's not just a crybaby, but he's a crybaby who can change his mother's fate.
Right, which is huge.
That makes it such great propaganda, Buddhist propaganda.
He mourns for his parents, but also does something about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about the sort of kind of entrepot that China was at this time. Mm-hmm. You don't think... I mean, China... Hegel talked about China as if it was cut off from history.
Right.
And we oftentimes view China in that way, as if it's a separate thing.
Yeah, it's like hermetically sealed.
Exactly. Which is total BS.
Right.
But it's probably more true of China than, I would say, the Middle East or something like that, because you've got all of these different cultures pulsing through. What's so fascinating about this is, at this time, China was not at all hermetically sealed. It's total. That is even more BS then than it is now. Mm-hmm. And what's so fascinating is that the story has Confucian elements, it has Buddhist elements, but now I'm also going to suggest that it has Christian elements.
This is where Lee and I got in the mini argument before we did the podcast. So let's hear it, Lee.
This is a story of a son who goes down to hell, who rescues, and this is the term that Eugene Youyang uses. I'm just quoting his translation. He refers to the mother as a sinner. Now, that's a highly problematic term in this context. I wouldn't use it. But he's trying to bring on the English-speaking reader into the story. But still, there is some sense that the mother, as a person who has violated a norm or a spiritual law, can't do anything about it. She has to have someone who's more holy, who is her son, come and rescue her from hell. And that's the only thing that she can do. It's only by someone else that she can be rescued from hell. I'm going to argue that there is some very tenuous elements of Christianity in this story. And I will also point out a couple of things. So if you go to Xi'an today, you can see a bunch of steles all gathered in one place. There was one of them that was written in the year 781. That's a record of the Nestorian Christian Church in Xi'an. So Christianity actually had large presence in China at that time, certainly much, much larger than it did in, we'll say, the year 1800, when it had largely died out. And also, as I mentioned before, this story was found in the Mogal caves in what's called the Library Cave. In Cave 17, there's actually a Nestorian image of Jesus drawn in one of the caves, painted in one of the caves. So my point is that there are all of these kind of intellectual traditions churning around China. And this story, although it's drawn from Sanskrit and Pali sources, is imbued with Confucian elements. So we know that it's kind of as it's being translated and adapted, it has other cultures kind of being fastened onto it, if you will. I'm going to argue that maybe there are some elements of Nestorian Christianity that are kind of being welded onto it as well.
It's possible. I mean, we have to sort of, it would be very tenuous. I mean, we're talking about a son rescuing a sinner from hell, but the son is the son of the person in hell, which is pretty much exactly the contrary to the Christian narrative. So insofar as a holy being rescues someone from hell, that much is somewhat related to at least the Christian tradition. But everything else, and this is part of our discussion beforehand, is when we get into a text like this and we start doing the influence spotting thing, that's a tricky game to play, right? Because this is, like you said, this is coming from so many different traditions at once, which is why it's so interesting. I think as a narrative, it's not really a page turner. I didn't read it going, what's going to happen to Mulian next? I was like, let's just get your mom out of whatever. But what's interesting is this, wow, that's clearly the impulse to look at it and go, well, that's clearly not Confucian tradition, but
this ain't your grandma's China.
This is not your grandma's China. It is not. No, it is not.
We ain't in Beijing anymore, Dorothy.
Lee says with his ruby slippers that he wears for every podcast.
You're not supposed to talk about those, Rob.
Yeah, it gives the listener a little bit of human drama, human color. What Lee and I were arguing about beforehand is Lee was like, I see some Christian elements here, and I was like, I don't really see that. What we did agree on is insofar as this reads very much like Dante's Inferno. We're not saying it's drawing from Dante's Inferno.
It's absolutely not.
But it's interesting that there's this similar impulse to sort of map the supernatural realms, right? And it could be from a similar place. We don't have really time to get into it now, but this could be very much a way of referencing some of the political goings-on at the time. A lot of Chinese vernacular fiction like to do that, and Dante's Inferno definitely does that. But there's an equal fascination with what is hell like really? Or what is heaven like really when you think about it?
In the version of the English translation that we have, this is actually in a section of stories from the archetypal questing man. Now, that's a Joseph Campbell theme. He's an anthropologist who was mildly famous in the 20th century. He's kind of dated now, I would say. But he had this theory, the man with 1,000 faces, that all of these heroes were drawn from a similar source. I am not entirely sure I agree with that, but what I will say is the fact that the source of this story is Indic, that it comes from India, suggests that it is coming out. It does seem to be coming out of this larger epic tradition. China is interesting because there's not really an epic. But in most of the Indo-European languages, we see epics that are related. I mean, you have Greek epics, you have Roman epics, you have Sanskritic epics. But in China, you don't. But this kind of functions like it's a very short story, but it kind of functions like an epic, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. It's a short. But structurally, it is like an epic. You have a journey, you have a task.
You have repeated kind of quests that he tries, he fails, he tries, he fails, he sort of succeeds, he continues to succeed, he fails, he then finally succeeds.
Right. And so it's interesting as a hybrid, really. Anyone picking this thing up thinking it's going to read like, the tasks of Hercules is going to be sorely disappointed because it's not really that, it doesn't have that sort of dramatic heft for me. when you read the Tasks of Hercules or someone even like Dante, even in Dante's Inferno, you go, what's he going to find next? This is crazy. In this one, the focus always shifts back to Mulian basically going to talk to the Buddha again and again. Like, what can I do to save my mom? So instead of returning you to the next level, the next task, we always keep going back to the same place, which is the Buddha. What does the Buddha say? And now we go visit another part of hell. It's not a particularly exciting epic.
Though, to be fair, I don't find Dante that exciting.
No, that's true. You don't.
He's a great writer, and his vividness is fantastic. But it's the same kind of thing. Like, he tries, he fails, Jesus comes, rescues him. He tries, he fails, Virgil helps him out.
That's true. Like, we're not talking about Harry Potter here. This is more like just I'm talking about what's the next realm. Like, when I read the Inferno the first time, I was like, ooh, what's realm number 2 going to be like? That's weird.
Yeah. I just think it's not as detailed as Dante, but structurally, I think it's quite similar.
Do you have any parting thoughts on the story?
I think the listener should take this story and read it, not because they're looking for a good bedtime nightstand read, but because they're interested in how this China is so much more cosmopolitan than I would say our image of China oftentimes is.
And that would be my parting thought too. Modern China even is not really going to make much sense if you buy into this hermetically sealed, mysterious kingdom.
Hegelian China.
Yeah, it doesn't. Modern China will not make sense, but it will make a great deal more sense if you realize that well into 1500, even 2000 years ago, there are innumerable cultural exchanges happening throughout what we now think of as China, and that created China as we know it today. So I think that's pretty crucial to bear in mind.
I think that's a good place to end it.
Yeah.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.